You ever notice how some people just can't do anything halfway? Like, if they hit the gym, suddenly they're training for the Olympics. Or if they start a side hustle, next thing you know they're running a 4-floor empire with branded coffee mugs. That's Julius Caesar. This man looked at politics and thought, too small. He looked at military campaigns and thought, gotta go bigger. Then he looked at Gaul, France, Belgium, parts of Switzerland, and thought, I'll just conquer all of that before lunch. And here's the crazy part, he did. But of course, the story isn't nearly that simple. Because standing in his way weren't just sheep farmers and bakers with baguettes, though honestly, I'd be terrified of a baker throwing a rolling pin at me. Gaul was home to fierce tribes, legendary warriors, chariots, ambushes, and one man in particular who very nearly became the stuff of global legend, Vercingetorix. That name alone sounds like a heavy metal band, and trust me, his story is equally epic. This war lasted 8 bloody, brilliant years, 58 to 50 BCE. It gave Caesar riches beyond imagination, an army more loyal to him than to Rome itself, and a fame so massive it scared the Roman Senate. And in return, Gaul lost its independence. Thousands of tribesmen paid the price, and Western Europe was forever folded into the Roman world. But here's the twist. The Gallic Wars weren't just about battles. They were about identity, about freedom versus empire, about one ambitious man writing his own legend while at the same time trying to erase the legends of his enemies. And plot twist, he left us the receipts. Caesar literally wrote his own history book about all this, turning himself from general into celebrity author of antiquity. Imagine conquering a country and then publishing your autobiography mid-campaign. That's the level of confidence we're dealing with, so buckle up. Because this is not just a story about Rome versus Gaul. It's about colossal egos, impossible feats of engineering, betrayals, brutal massacres, dazzling comebacks, and one final siege that looks like it was lifted straight out of an action movie. We'll meet ambitious politicians, migrating tribes, warriors with flowing mustaches, druids whispering to the gods, Roman legions building bridges across entire rivers in 10 days flat, and a showdown at a fortress named Alesia that will leave you speechless. This, my friends, isn't just history. It's one of the greatest dramas ever lived. And it's about time we told it the way it deserves to be told, not as dusty dates, but as an epic tale, full of fire, grit, and yes, a few laughs along the way. Welcome to the Gallic Wars, Julius Caesar's Road to Immortality. Chapter 1. Rome meets the Gauls. Beginneth. Rome had a list of things that kept them up at night. The ancient world's version of doomsday anxieties. You can bet the Gauls would be written in big, scary letters at the top. Why? Because the Gauls had already done it once, way back in 390 BCE, a couple centuries before Julius Caesar. Gaulish warriors marched down from the north, beat a Roman army at the river Allia, and then strolled casually into Rome like they owned the place. They sacked the city, burned it, looted it, shouted surprise, and terrified every Roman for generations. The story goes that the Romans were only saved after paying the Gauls a massive ransom. Piles of gold so big the scales themselves were tampered with. And when the Romans protested, the Gallic chief Brennus famously said, "Woe to the vanquished, that humiliation stuck. Imagine being a hyper-proud empiring making, and having one of your origin stories be, yeah, some mustachioed barbarians made us cry and stole our lunch money. Yikes. Romans never forgot. By the time Julius Caesar came onto the scene in the late 50s BCE, the Gauls weren't just a foreign people, they were a boogeyman. Parents scared their kids into obedience with stories of Hannibal at the gates from the Punic Wars. But the Gauls are coming was the Roman bedtime horror story that never really stopped giving chills. Enter Caesar. Stage left. Now let's zoom 300 years forward. It's 58 BCE. Julius Caesar has just been elected to one of the highest positions in Roman politics, consul, which is basically co-president of the Republic. Only with more backstabbing senators, gold-greased elections, and togas flapping around, as Consul Caesar had already bent the rules and smoothed over scandals with his famous allies, Pompey and Crassus, the so-called First Triumvirate. But 1 year of political office wasn't enough for him. Caesar wasn't satisfied shaking hands. He wanted action. He wanted armies. And let's be real, he wanted personal glory. The Senate handed him a new role, governor of Cisalpine Gaul, that's northern Italy, already under Roman control, Illyricum, the Balkans, and a little strip of Transalpine Gaul, southern France. Congratulations, Julius, they probably said. It's a quiet gig. Collect taxes. Keep the borders safe. They might as well have told a toddler. Here's a box of crayons. Don't draw on the walls. Naturally, Caesar grabbed the metaphorical crayon and started coloring outside all the lines. Gaul, a pressure cooker of tribes at the time. Gaul wasn't one single place. It was a messy, boiling stew of tribes. Some were Celtic-speaking farmers, others horse-loving warriors, others merchant-like, trading salt and amber across Europe. These tribes fought constantly among themselves, rival alliances, betrayals, brothers fighting brothers. There were three main broad groups. Caesar himself described in his commentaries the Aquitani in the southwest closer to Spain, the Belgi up north, today's Belgium, Netherlands, and then the big mass of central Gaul just called, well, the Gauls. The Romans painted them all with the same savage barbarian with wild hair and a shield brush. But the truth was far more complicated. Some were highly organized, built fortified towns, oppida, traded with Mediterranean merchants, and had leadership councils. They weren't cavemen, but Roman propaganda needed them to look less civilized, because if ruthless conquest looked like bringing civilization, well, that felt more noble than plain old empire building. So when huge problems started brewing in Gaul, Caesar didn't see chaos. He saw opportunity. The trouble begins. The Helvetii migration in 58 BCE. The Helvetii, a Celtic tribe from what's now Switzerland, decided they'd had enough of cramped mountain valleys. They packed up men, women, kids, supplies, and even their wagons and set out in a grand migration to settle somewhere greener and richer. Further west in Gaul now, picture it, not just a few families moving, but nearly 300,000 people on the move. It was like Woodstock meets the Oregon Trail, but way more dangerous and with more mustaches. The problem is, when you move hundreds of thousands of people with herds and wagons, you tend to step on toes. The Gallic tribes in their path panicked. Tribes allied with Rome sent help. messages across the Alps. If the Helvetii settled wherever they pleased, it meant instability along Rome's borders. Caesar, perched in his governorship of Gaul, saw the SOS signals and he saw a chance to turn himself into Rome's heroic protector. With lightning speed, Caesar marched north. He blocked the Helvetii at the Rhine River, chopping bridges, chasing them inland. Eventually, at the Battle of Bibracte, Caesar's legions clashed with the Helvetii in full force. Roman discipline and their tight formation warfare proved too much for the swarming tribal warriors. It was brutal. After days of fighting, the Helvetii were crushed. Survivors were forced to return home to their valleys, humbled and broken. And Julius Caesar, too, after his first big victory, came out looking like the shining knight in armor who had saved Gaul's allies. Spoiler: this was just the beginning of his PR campaign. Nervous neighbors. The Germans across the Rhine barely had the dust settled before Caesar faced another crisis. This time, it wasn't Gauls, but Germans. Led by their king Ariovistus, German tribes had crossed the Rhine into Gaul and were bullying local peoples into submission. Rome wasn't about to let Germans establish a permanent foothold right on the Gallic frontier, so Caesar, quick as ever, marched against Ariovistus. And here's where Caesar's flair for drama really shines. Before the battle even started, he met Ariovistus for a face-to-face negotiation. Imagine these two swaggering egos glaring at each other across the plain. Ariovistus boasting about his warriors. Caesar countering with the cold confidence of legions. It didn't work. Obviously, it just built suspense for the inevitable clash when fighting finally broke out. Rome's iron-disciplined lines overcame Ariovistus's larger, cruder force. Once again, Caesar cast himself as Rome's champion, this time saving Gaul from a foreign invader. Never mind that Rome itself was the biggest foreign invader of all. It was all in the spin. The stage is set by the end of just 1 year 58. BCE. Caesar had saved Rome's allies from the migrating Helvetii, chased back Germans, and presented himself as the guardian of order in Gaul, back in Rome. His dispatches, carefully self-written reports, turned him into a sensation. Senators read them, citizens repeated them, and Caesar's legend began to spread. Letters home painted him as not just a general, but the man destined to bring Gaul under Roman civilization. But what Caesar hadn't planned on was just how much resistance Gaul had left in it. The tribes were restless, tired of Roman arrogance, and determined to hold on to their freedom. The Helvetii and Ariovistus episodes were just the opening acts. Bigger rebellions, grander coalitions, and more terrifying battles lay just ahead. Still, at this point, Caesar was grinning. He had soldiers who adored him, political rivals back home, grumbling but unable to deny his victories, and a frontier that was now his personal playground. The Roman Republic had given Julius Caesar a governorship to keep him busy, and, instead, they had handed him the stage of a lifetime. Rome and the Gauls had clashed before, centuries ago, but this time it was going to be different. This time, the story wasn't about a terrified Rome begging for mercy. It was about a relentless Caesar carving out his destiny in the blood-soaked fields of Gaul. And trust me, things were about to get very bloody. Chapter 2: The Helvetii Migration, Trouble at the Borders. History had a weird, moving out of the neighborhood story. The Helvetii migration of 58 BCE would be it. The Helvetii weren't some tiny tribe looking for a cozy patch of farmland. These people came in force force. By Caesar's count, though Caesar loved exaggerating numbers, for the drama some 300,000 men, women, and children began packing up their entire existence, livestock, wagons, and all, and setting off westward through Gaul. Think of it like this. You wake up one morning and suddenly discover that your neighbor's entire city has decided to move across your backyard, dragging every barn, goat, and screaming toddler with them. Call it the ancient equivalent of a human traffic jam stretching hundreds of miles, and like all massive road trips, it was bound to cause trouble. Why were the Helvetii moving? The Helvetii lived up in the mountains, where modern Switzerland is today, wedged into valleys, surrounded by picturesque peaks. But life in those valleys wasn't exactly a Swiss chocolate commercial. Land was cramped. Resources were stretched thin. The Helvetii were tough mountain people, but they longed for wider plains, easier farming, and more control of their destiny. So, around 61 BCE, their leaders came up with a plan. Let's torch the old villages, pack the wagons, and migrate west to new pasture land, and not just a few families, entire communities. They even burned their homes behind them, super dramatic style, like, well, guess we're really committed to this now. It sounds bold and a little inspiring. Freedom, new horizons, manifest destiny. But here's the problem. In moving west, the Helvetii would be cutting straight through central Gaul, into territory controlled by tribes allied to Rome, and Caesar, sitting just across the Alps, wasn't about to let hundreds of thousands of armed Celts march willy-nilly into his backyard. Letters to Caesar, help. They're coming. When these Gaulish tribes saw the endless column of Helvetii wagons rolling past, they panicked and sent frantic messengers south to Caesar's camp. Dear Julius, massive horde of mountain savages is crossing our land. PLS, send legions. Sincerely, every tribe in Gaul that doesn't want to get flattened. For Caesar, this was like hearing opportunity knocking at his door. Remember, he wasn't just a governor trying to keep the peace. He was an ambitious politician looking for excuses to start a war that would give him fame, loyalty of troops, and piles of cash. And here it was, a ready-made crisis falling right into his lap. He moved fast, gathering his legions. Caesar intercepted the Helvetii early near Geneva, modern-day Geneva, Switzerland. His tactic: good old-fashioned Roman engineering. He blocked bridges over the Rhine River by building fortifications and walls for miles along the bank. Picture a long trench and palisade wall stretching like ancient barbed wire. The Helvetii tried every trick to cross, but the Romans stubbornly said, "No, you're not getting through here." Caesar's friendliness, with a knife behind his back. Now Caesar was clever. He didn't present this as aggression. No, he styled himself as protector of Rome's allies in Gaul. He justified every move as defensive. But under the surface, he was doing what Caesar always did, seizing the spotlight. The Helvetii, blocked at Geneva, had to divert north, trudging through rougher country. For weeks, they crept westward, raiding as they went, clashing with smaller Gallic tribes in the way. Behind them, chasing like a wolf, trailing a herd, marched Caesar's Roman legions. Constant skirmishes flared, but Caesar bided his time, waiting for the perfect ground to strike decisively. That ground turned out to be near Bibracte, the Battle of Bibracte, Caesar's Big Break. Bibracte was the fortified hilltop capital of the Aedui tribe, one of Rome's Gallic allies. The Helvetii, running low on supplies from all their wandering, camped nearby and sent raiding parties to gather grain. Caesar realized his moment had come. He had about 30,000 to 35,000 Roman soldiers split across 4 legions, plus allied auxiliaries. The Helvetii of Caesar's inflated numbers are to be believed outnumbered him several times over. But numbers don't always win battles. Discipline and timing do, and Rome had both. The Romans took up position on a ridge near Bibracte. From there, they marched downhill in classic formation, heavy infantry in lines, flanked by cavalry. The Helvetii, meanwhile, massed their migrants into an enormous, chaotic block of warriors, family wagons parked behind them. Imagine your wife, kids, grandpa, and goat all shoved behind the army line while you're supposed to fight. It's not the best setup. When the clash began, the Romans hurled pila-heavy javelins into the Helvetii mass, shattering their wooden shields and making those formations messy. Then the legionaries advanced, shields locked like iron walls, short gladi stabbing in disciplined waves. The Helvetii charged bravely, their ferocity legendary. But they couldn't break the machine. The fighting dragged on, surging back and forth. At one point, the Helvetii almost pushed into Roman lines. Remember, these were tough warriors, not amateurs. But Caesar brought reinforcements from his flanks, and slowly the Gallic line bent, then broke. The battle dissolved into chaos, the Helvetii retreating back to their wagons. There, in scenes as heartbreaking as they were messy, women and children armed themselves to fight alongside the warriors. But against Roman steel discipline, it was hopeless. The day ended with shattered wagons, mass casualties, and broken morale. Caesar's victory, and Gaul takes notice when it was all over. What remained of the Helvetii were forced to surrender. Caesar, in his usual mix of carrot and stick, spared the survivors but ordered them to march back to their burned-out homelands and rebuild. Basically, sorry about that whole massacre thing, now go back to your valleys and never do this again. This wasn't mercy so much as cold calculation. Caesar wanted the Helvetii back where they'd started, acting as a buffer between Rome's territory and the restless Germans across the Rhine. He couldn't afford them becoming raiders elsewhere in Gaul. But the bigger picture, this first major victory made Caesar a legend. Word spread like wildfire through Gaul. The Romans weren't just poking their noses in, they were here to stay. And behind them stood commanders who didn't hesitate to annihilate entire peoples back in Rome. Caesar sent glowing reports of his triumph in the classic third person. Caesar did this. Caesar saved that. Caesar smote the barbarians. The Senate and the people ate it up. From politician with debts to conquering hero in just one campaign, it was the makeover of a lifetime. The stage expands for the Gauls, though this was just the beginning. Some tribes saw Caesar as a protector against rivals and thought, maybe Rome's not so bad. Others saw him for what he was, a conqueror, methodically weaving Rome into their affairs until they'd all be slaves or dead. The Helvetii had been crushed, resettled, and made an example. Caesar had flexed Rome's muscles, shown its engineering brilliance. and displayed terrifying efficiency on the battlefield. Gaul wasn't pacified. It was only stunned and, like a boxer who takes one hard punch but stays standing, Gaul wasn't done yet. Not even close. Because the Helvetii may have lit the fuse, but the fireworks had only just begun. Caesar, for his part, wasn't going to stop with one victory. He'd already tasted the glory, the adoration, the thrill of thousands cheering his name back in Rome. And once Caesar got a taste of something, he never, ever let go. Up north, in the dark forests of Belgic territory, whole alliances of tribes were already murmuring, "Rome is dangerous. Caesar must be stopped." The Helvetii migration was just chapter 1 in Gaul's story of resistance. The real storm was about to break, and in that storm, Caesar would test every trick, tactic, and ounce of ambition he had. Chapter 3: Ariovistus and the German Menacif. The Helvetii migration had been Caesar's trial run. The next act of the Gallic Wars was a whole different level of menace, because now it wasn't just restless Gauls causing trouble. It was something far scarier in Roman imagination. Germans, Rome's nightmare next door. The word German in Roman ears conjured up images of giants hiding in misty forests, monsters with spears, and wild tribes completely indifferent to rules of civilized warfare. Romans were nervous about these people across the Rhine long before Caesar showed up. And to be fair, the Germans really were different from the settled Gauls. They were often semi-nomadic, fiercer cavalry fighters, less prone to big walled towns, and more unpredictable in Caesar's eyes. A particular Germanic warlord named Ariovistus had crossed the Rhine with his Swabi tribesmen. At first, Gaulish tribes like the Sequani had actually invited him in to help them fight rival tribes. Classic move. Hey, let's call in scary foreign mercenaries to deal with our local beef. Yeah, predictably, it backfired spectacularly. Ariovistus and his horde had come, tasted Gaul, and refused to leave. Before long, Ariovistus wasn't an invited guest anymore. He was an overlord. Entire Gallic tribes were paying tribute to his Swabi warriors. Their families were being taken hostage. Ariovistus ruled by intimidation, squeezing Gaul like a warlord mafia boss. And every season he promised to bring in more Germans from across the Rhine. For the Gallic tribes, this was a nightmare. Their temporary ally was mutating into a full-blown conqueror. So, naturally, who did they call? Julius Caesar, defender of Gaul's fragile freedom. Insert sarcastic smirk here. Caesar smells opportunity when envoys from the Gauls came sprinting into Caesar's camp in 58 BCE. Their pitch was simple: help us, or we're doomed. Ariovistus is eating us alive. He'll bring in so many Germans, we'll all be swept away. To the Romans, this was pure catnip. Caesar now didn't just have Gauls to fight, but a foreign threat that could be billed as invading Roman territory, since Gaul was sort of, under Rome's protection. This wasn't just war. This was public relations gold. Defeat Ariovistus, and Caesar wouldn't simply be conquering Gaulzy, be protecting Rome from monstrous Germans spilling over the Rhine. In the propaganda game, this was priceless. Diplomatic theater, but Caesar wasn't about to jump into battle straight away. No, first, he staged some high-drama diplomacy, because that would make the story all the grander when negotiations inevitably collapsed. He sent envoys to Ariovistus with demands. They were intentionally outrageous. Stop oppressing Rome's Gallic allies. Hand back hostages. Promise no more. German settlement in Gaul. Ariovistus, sitting smugly with his warband, basically laughed in the diplomats' faces. His reply was something like, "Who the hell is Caesar to tell me what to do? Everything I got, I won fair and square. If Caesar wants to stop me, he can try it on the battlefield. And by the way, I'm not his subject, I'm a king. Rome can mind its own business." In a way, Ariovistus was right. Power respected power. And Gaul wasn't technically Roman, but Caesar didn't want technically. He wanted an excuse. Next came an in-person meeting. Caesar and Ariovistus facing each other out on the plain. Can you picture it? Caesar, polished Roman aristocrat, with his fine cloak, polished armor, and iron-willed legions behind him. Opposite him, Ariovistus, hulking German king, basking in his reputation for barbarian terror. Their entourages must have bristled with tension. The meeting went about as poorly as you'd expect. Caesar made his demands again. Ariovistus mocked Roman arrogance. Voices rose. Threats flew. Finally, Caesar stormed back to camp, dramatically declaring that Ariovistus had rejected peace. Cue the villain music. Caesar's army gets spooked now. Here's the funny thing. After all this showboating, Caesar's own soldiers looked at the size of Ariovistus's German horde and started panicking. These men weren't cowards, but the Germans had a reputation for being terrifying, with wild hair, frightening war songs, and, most alarmingly, huge cavalry numbers. Some legions straight up didn't want to fight. Rumors spread in camp that the Germans would crush them. Caesar, sensing his army's courage wavering, gave one of his patented pep talks. It was a mix of guilt trip and swagger. Fine. If you cowards don't want to follow me, I'll take just the 10th Legion and fight the Germans myself. And when we win, you'll be too ashamed to look me in the eye. It worked. Soldiers hate being labeled cowards. The army's pride kicked back in, morale steadied, and Caesar got what he wanted, an army ready to go all in against Ariovistus. The showdown, Caesar versus Ariovistus. Two forces finally met somewhere in Alsace. Eastern Gaul, Ariovistus brought a horde of German warriors and massive cavalry. Caesar had 6 legions disciplined, flexible, circling, testing, waiting for advantage. Finally, battle was joined. The Germans opened with a fierce rush, shield walls banging, chants roaring across the field. Their cavalry swooped in, deadly fast. But this time, Caesar had a trick. Anticipating the cavalry threat, he integrated extra cohorts of infantry into his cavalry lines. Instead of charging into open space, the German horsemen rammed into a mixed wall of spears, breaking their momentum. Roman adaptability once again neutralized barbarian fury. The legions pressed forward, heavy shields bracing against the oncoming Germans. Step by step, disciplined rows shoved Ariovistus's warriors backward. The Germans fought ferociously. This wasn't a quick collapse, but discipline beat fury. Slowly at first, then suddenly, Ariovistus's lines broke. Panic rippled across the German ranks. The retreat turned into a rout. Only a fraction of Ariovistus's men escaped across the Rhine, abandoning Gaul entirely. Ariovistus himself fled with them, humiliated. Spinmaster Caesar didn't just win a battle, he won the narrative. As soon as the dust settled, he sent glowing dispatches back to Rome. He painted Ariovistus as a terrifying menace bent on pouring German hordes into Roman territory. And who had stopped them? Caesar, of course, the savior, the protector, the man standing firm where others faltered. Rome ate it up. The Senate, even the senators who secretly hated Caesar, couldn't deny the PR storm surging around him. Ordinary citizens cheered. Ariovistus had been turned into a boogeyman, and Caesar into Rome's knight in shining armor for banishing him. Why this mattered though? Defeat of Ariovistus changed everything in Gaul. Suddenly, Caesar wasn't just a temporary fixer dealing with Helvetii migrations. He was the power broker. He had proven that not even the feared Germans could beat him. For the Gallic tribes, the message was deafening. If you resist Rome, you'll meet the same fate as Ariovistus. At the same time, if you ally with Caesar, you'll enjoy the protection of the only man who can deal with invaders bigger than yourself. It was a masterclass in domination military victory, combined with the careful PR spin that made Caesar look indispensable. And make no mistake, skyrocketed Caesar's political capital. His soldiers were now battle-hardened and loyal. His popularity in Rome soared, and Gaul was realizing this Roman governor wasn't here just to babysit. He was here to stay. Curtain call with Ariovistus's defeat. The Rhine itself became the symbolic border. Gaul had essentially fallen under Rome's shadow. But of course, Caesar wasn't stopping there. The Germans might have been shoved back across the river, but Gaul itself was restless. New alliances were forming, ones that would rise in waves of resistance far bloodier than anything Ariovistus had thrown at him. The German menace had tested Caesar's army and strengthened his reputation. The next test would come from Gaul itself, from a coalition that called themselves the Belgae, and they were ready to show Caesar that he hadn't conquered anything yet. Chapter 4. The Belgae alliances, the Helvetii migration, and the Ariovistus showdown were Caesar's opening acts. The next challenge came roaring from the north, the Belgae. These were no ordinary Gauls. In Roman eyes, the Belgae were wilder, tougher, and, crucially, closer to those intimidating German tribes beyond the Rhine. Caesar himself, ever the spin doctor, declared that the Belgae were the bravest of all the Gauls. Of course, he meant it as a backhanded compliment. Brave, in the sense of they're insane enough to fight Rome. But to the Belgae, it was probably a badge of honor. Who were the Belgae? The Belgae weren't a single tribe. They were a coalition of northern peoples living in what's now roughly Belgium, parts of northern France, and the southern Netherlands. Fierce warriors, skilled farmers, and stubbornly independent. They didn't like the idea of anyone bossing them around, least of all some smooth-talking Roman governor. Word of Caesar's expanding power must have sent alarm bells through their councils. If he was willing to chase Germans out and crush Gauls to the south, what was to stop him from marching north and deciding their lands also needed protection? So the Belgae did the one thing that Caesar feared most. They united. Tribes that had hated each other for generations suddenly started swearing brotherhood oaths, tying their mustaches together, okay? Maybe not literally. And promising to resist Rome as one. By Caesar's count, this alliance summoned over 60,000 warriors. Romans loved inflating enemy numbers to make victories look bigger. So it's hard to know the exact figure, but it was definitely huge. This wasn't a petty rebellion. This was northern Gaul saying, "No more Rome. Enough." Caesar responds. When Caesar got wind of the Belgic alliance, he sprang into action. His response was pure Caesar. Move fast, hit hard, and divide the enemy before they know what's happening. Marching north with 6 legions, he used Rome's secret weapon, engineering, in hostile territory full of swamps and rivers. Caesar's men threw up pontoon bridges, built marching camps every night, and moved like a juggernaut of steel and discipline to the Belgae. It must have been surreal. One day you're farming peacefully. The next, a Roman army has built an entire fort on your doorstep overnight. Rome wasn't just an enemy, it was a machine. Worry forward relentlessly. The sheer efficiency of the Romans unnerved some Belgic tribes. When Caesar started advancing, a few quickly lost their nerve, surrendering hostages and switching sides rather than face him in pitched battle. Divide and conquer, that was Caesar's favorite trick. He chipped away at the coalition before it could strike in full force, but not all of them were scared. Far from it. Some were more than ready to test their mettle against the legions. Into the Belgic wildstuff. Campaign across Belgic territory was brutal. Rivers and marshes twisted across the landscape, making maneuvering difficult. The Romans had to fight both the land and the people. Caesar's sources tell us of endless skirmishes, sudden raids, and councils with wavering tribes. At one point, Caesar faced a huge host of Belgae at the river Ain. He used a clever double trap, building fortified camps on both sides of the river to tempt the enemy into attacking, then ambushing them midstream when they tried to cross. They were beaten off, and the coalition began to crumble further. One by one, cracks formed. But there was one tribe that did not crumble. The Nervi. The Nervi, Rome's worst nightmare, according to Caesar. And remember, he loved painting stories dramatically. The Nervi were the Spartans of Gaul, fierce, poor, and austere. They forbade wine traders to enter their lands to avoid softness. They lived hard, fought hard, and loathed Rome with a vengeance. So while other tribes drifted toward surrender, the Nervi plotted a more radical strategy. Ambush. They studied Caesar's marching habits carefully. Romans were systematic. Every night they built massive fortified camps, digging trenches and piling earthen walls. But to do that, they had to set down their baggage train and unpack tools. The Nervi realized that if they struck at the precise moment between arriving and fortifications finished, they could catch even legions vulnerable. And that's exactly what they planned to do. The ambush at the Sabist climactic moment came near the river Sabis, modern Sambra. Caesar led his column of legions to the river to make camp. His advance cavalry clashed with Nervi scouts, but he assumed it was just light skirmishing. Confident, he ordered his men to start building fortifications. Then all at once, the Nervi came thundering out of the woods. Their entire force, tens of thousands of warriors, poured across the floodplain and river in a sudden, overwhelming charge. For a heartbeat, the Roman army was caught completely off guard. The baggage wagons were still scattered, soldiers half-armored, trenches only half-dug. Caesar's carefully drilled machine almost collapsed right there. Legionaries scrambled in chaos. nervy warriors hacked into the disorganized lines, cutting down officers, swarming baggage carriers, and driving at the heart of the camp. Caesar himself, for once, found panic spreading among his forces. Caesar's hero moment, and here's where Caesar, in his own memoirs, turns the moment into personal legend. According to Caesar, when the Nervi slammed into his disarrayed troops, he personally grabbed a shield from a soldier, ran to the front, and rallied his men by sheer force of presence. Think of him striding through dust and blood, cloak flying, shouting orders, and swinging a sword. Whether it played out exactly like that or not, the fact is, the Romans steadied. Caesar's lieutenants scrambled to reorganize the cohorts. The legions locked together, centurions shouting, shields interlaced against the flood of Nervi. Slowly, the chaos coalesced into the disciplined wall Rome was known for. Still, the Nervi's ferocity was terrifying. At one point, Caesar admits, the fighting was hand-to-hand, right inside the Roman camp. By his account, nearly all the Nervi fought to the death, refusing to retreat even when surrounded. So determined were they that women and children, hidden behind, were said to plead with warriors, not to flee but die fighting. It nearly worked. For hours, the legions bled under unrelenting pressure. But the sheer discipline of Roman tactics and, crucially, timely reinforcement. Fresh cohorts arrived and crushed Nervi from the flanks. One by one, Gallic warriors fell. At last, their numbers gave out. Caesar reports that the Nervi were virtually annihilated. Out of 60,000, only a handful of survivors remained to surrender. Close call and public relations triumph for Caesar. This was both his worst scare and his greatest triumph so far. The Nervi had nearly pulled off the impossible, but in failing, they only made Caesar look like more of a hero. His dispatches to Rome painted a tale of staggering enemy courage, overcome by Roman grit, of course. Caesar himself, at the center of it, shield in hand, back home. People read these reports like today's best-selling war thriller. Caesar wasn't just winning wars. He was writing his own legend, Lev. Aftermath: a collapse of the Nervi cemented Roman dominance in Belgic territory. Though pockets of resistance remained, the coalition shattered. Some tribes licked their wounds and agreed to live under Caesar's new friendship. Others, like the few survivors of the Nervi, were left broken, their people decimated. But the larger lesson was clear. Unity hadn't worked. Ambush hadn't worked. Bravery hadn't worked. Caesar and his Romans seemed unstoppable. Yet, inside that story of conquest, you can still see the cracks showing. Caesar had been nearly destroyed, saved only by discipline and luck. The Gauls might not have won, but they'd proved something scary. Rome was not invincible. And as word spread of the Nervi's defiancy in death, it planted a seed in all of Gaul. Someday, maybe, if the right leader emerged to unite them all, Caesar's machine could be stopped. Chapter 5. Building Bridges, Caesar and Engineering Marvels. Imagine this. You've just beaten up half of northern Gaul, narrowly survived a terrifying ambush against the Nervi, and established yourself as the big kid on the Gallic playground. Most people would take a breather, file some Senate reports, maybe have a glass of wine and relax. But Julius Caesar? No, Julius Caesar looked around, cracked his knuckles, and thought, you know what would look really good in my next self-written war story? If I crossed the biggest river in Europe, by building a bridge where no bridge should exist. This wasn't just military strategy. This was performance art. It was psychological theater. The Rhine River wasn't just a body of water. It was a symbolic frontier. The line dividing Gaul, Rome's new stomping ground, and Germania, the mysterious homeland of those wild Germanic tribes Rome feared so much. No Roman army had ever dared cross it in force. And so, naturally, Caesar had to do it. Trouble on the frontier after the Belgic coalition collapsed, and the Nervi were smashed barely. Caesar turned his attention eastward. Reports poured in. German tribes kept slipping across the Rhine, raiding Gallic villages, messing with Rome's new friends. These Germans weren't just Ariovistus's leftovers, they were new arrivals. Restless warriors moving westwards. For Caesar, this was perfect. He could frame his next campaign not as Roman aggression, but as protecting Gaul from the long shadow of Germania. He could position himself, once again, as the great defender of Rome. At the same time, he wanted to send a loud, booming message across the Rhine. Don't even think about coming over here again. Rome's watching. But instead of simply chasing them back, Caesar decided to go viral with his military flex. He wouldn't just drive them off, he'd cross into their homeland on a bridge built by his own men. Engineering madness. Roman-style. Picture the task set before Caesar's legions. "Boys," he says casually, "we're going to build a wooden bridge across the Rhine." Yes, that Rhine. Is there another? Now, the Rhine wasn't some small stream. This was a 1,300-kilometer monster of a river, wide, fast, and unpredictable. Crossing it with rafts or boats might have been possible. But bridges, permanent, stable, military-grade bridges. Nobody in their right mind would even suggest it for an invading force on a deadline. Except the Romans. Because when it came to over-engineering projects on impossible timelines, the Romans were history's original masters. Somewhere, centuries later, American railroad foremen and NASA engineers nodded in spiritual solidarity. So, how did they do it? The legions fanned out, chopping trees, stripping trunks, cutting timbers into beams. Huge piles, basically giant sharpened logs, were rammed down into the riverbed at angles, forming pairs that leaned toward each other like chopsticks. Crossbeams lashed the piles together, braced against the Rhine's furious current. Massive decking was laid across the top. The genius was in the angles and counter-supports, designed to withstand rushing water and drifting debris. It wasn't just a bridge. It was a declaration. Nature bends to Rome. And here's the kicker. Took just 10 days. In less than 2 weeks, Caesar and his engineers built a bridge sturdy enough for thousands of soldiers, wagons, and cavalry to march across 10 days. Even modern engineers, reading Caesar's account, nod and say, "Okay, that's actually insane." Marching into the unknown once complete, Caesar assembled his legions and stepped onto the bridge. Imagine the scene, a line of armored legionaries marching in perfect rhythm, pila glinting, shields clattering, the sound carrying over the water like drums of doom. German tribes watching from the far bank must have been frozen in shock, because that was the point. The Germans had probably assumed rivers were natural protective barriers. You could raid across them, but the Romans would never dare bring their entire war machine over. And suddenly here it was. 6 legions walking on timber where water should be. The campaign that wasn't so did Caesar march deep into Germany, fight epic battles, topple kings. No, not really. In fact, this is where the brilliance of the entire stunt becomes clear. Caesar's campaign across the Rhine lasted less than 3 weeks. He crossed, wandered a bit, burned a few empty villages. Most tribes had wisely run to the forests, accepted some hostages, scared the life out of everyone, and then, after making his point, he marched back. The bridge, mission accomplished, was dismantled behind him. The point had never been to conquer Germania. The point was to show he could. Psychological warfare. Militarily, Caesar's Rhine crossing achieved very little. No territory was seized, no great conquests made. But symbolically, it was genius. The message to the Germans was crystal clear. You thought the Rhine protected you. Nope, Rome can walk here whenever we feel like it. Sleep tight. The message to the Gauls was even more important. We're not just defending you, we're gods of logistics. No enemy is safe, no frontier too far. Stick with Caesar, and Rome will protect you from everyone. And the message to Rome itself. Oh, that was Caesar's favorite audience. In his official report, his commentaries, he presented the Rhine crossing as a triumph of Roman willpower, discipline, and, naturally, his own brilliance. Back in the city, senators and citizens alike must have gawked at the audacity. He hadn't just fought battles, he had literally redrawn geography. The bridge, as legend historians ever since have remembered this not as a campaign, but as a flex. Napoleon studied it. Military engineers still shake their heads at it. And Caesar, he knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't a bridge, it was a stage. It was a piece of political theater, crafted from timber and sweat. By building it, Caesar walked his men into the realm of legend, because sometimes, in history, the act itself matters more than its practical results. In fact, he did it twice. A year later, in 53 BCE, after another round of German raids, Caesar ordered his legions to throw up yet another Rhine bridge, again in record time. He crossed, stomped around, terrified more tribes, then wandered back. 2 bridges, no lasting conquest, but an unshakable demonstration of Rome's global reach, Caesar's growing authority. Rhine stunts mattered because they weren't just feats of engineering, they were part of Caesar's growing mythology. Every campaign in Gaul wasn't just a fight. It was a chapter in the epic he was crafting about himself. Remember, he was literally publishing dispatches, writing his own war as it happened. When Romans read about their general building bridges across Germany's mighty frontier, he didn't just look like a conqueror. He looked like a man chosen by the gods to tame chaos, and that aura was dangerous. Every nail hammered into the Rhine bridge was also another nail driving Caesar's political rivals crazy back in Rome. Pompey, Crassus, the Senate, they all knew this was no longer the story of Rome in Gaul. It was Caesar in Gaul. The distinction mattered. A general whose fame eclipsed the Republic itself was a general destined to reshape Roman politics forever. Curtain drop on the Rhine. So, yes, Caesar's bridge wasn't about conquest or even about Germany. It was about message. To the Gauls. Don't resist to the Germans. Don't invade to Rome. Don't forget who the real superstar of the Republic is. It's the guy who builds rivers into walkways. And so, plank by plank, Caesar wasn't just expanding Rome's borders. He was expanding the boundaries of imagination. He was telling the world no frontier, natural or human, is beyond the reach of Roman will, of Caesar's will. Chapter 6. Crossing the Channel. Caesar in Britain. When you've already built a bridge across the Rhine just to freak people out, what do you do for an encore? If you're Julius Caesar, the answer is simple. You go to Britain. Yes, Britain. That strange, misty island that lay across the channel, shrouded in mystery. Romans had heard of it, of course, but in 55 BCE, Britain was less a real part of the Roman world and more a land of legends. Traders whispered of tribal kings, of fierce painted warriors who went into battle with blue bodies and wild hair, of strange chariots zooming across the battlefield like living war machines. Caesar, always with a nose for spectacle, thought, I'll invade that. Why Britain? Now, let's be clear. Caesar did not really need to invade Britain. No Roman Senate policy demanded it. Rome wasn't running out of grain or desperate for British tin or prospects, but Caesar wasn't just a general. He was a politician feeding his own legend. And Britain looked like the perfect place to do it. In his commentaries, Caesar hints that Britain had been sending aid to Gaulish rebels. That was his excuse. But really, crossing the channel meant glory. Nobody had done it before. Nobody had even considered it practical. If Gaul made him famous, imagine how untouchable he'd look if he claimed he'd fought at the edge of the known world, beyond the familiar lands of Europe. On that windswept island, it was pure PR ambition. But ambition was Caesar's entire brand. First crossing, 55 BCE. Caesar organized about 80 transport ships, packed with 2 legions, roughly 10,000 soldiers. He wasn't bringing his full army. This was a reconnaissance mission, part scouting, part theater, part personal dare. Setting out from Gaul's coast, the Romans gazed at the white cliffs of Dover rising from the mist. And lining those cliffs, massed ranks of Britons, painted and shouting, weapons flashing in the sun. They weren't going to make landfall easy, so Caesar sailed up the coast to find a better landing spot. But even there, it was chaos. Picture it. Roman soldiers trying to disembark from ships into waist-deep water, weighed down by armor and shields, while Britons charged them with spears and chariots right on the shoreline. The Romans floundered. The Britons had every advantage. It was a disaster in motion, until, according to Caesar's story, one brave standard-bearer of the 10th Legion leaped into the sea, shouting to his comrades, "Follow me, unless you want your eagle captured." For Romans, the legionary eagle was sacred. You'd do anything not to let it fall. Fired up, the soldiers splashed into the surf, formed up, and began pushing the Britons back. Little by little, the beachhead was won. Caesar had his foothold on the mysterious island, but the campaign was messy. The Roman cavalry transports were delayed, cutting Caesar off from mobility. A storm wrecked many of his ships, leaving soldiers scrambling to repair them on foreign shores. Skirmishes with Britons dragged on, with little to show for it. Supplies dwindled, and winter loomed after a few inconclusive fights. Caesar, wisely if reluctantly, pulled his forces back to Gaul. The first invasion was no glorious conquest, but it had proved the point. He had crossed into Britain, fought on its soil, and returned alive for many Romans. That alone was insane enough to sound like victory. second invasion. 54 BC. Almost generals would have stopped right there. But Caesar, he doubled down. The very next year, 54 BCE, he prepared a far bigger assault. 800 ships, 25,000 men, plus cavalry and supplies. This was no quick raid. This was a show of serious power. Britain, brace yourself. This time, the landings went smoother. Roman numbers were overwhelming. Briton tribes initially fought bravely, but were unable to resist the sheer momentum of Rome's arrival. Still, Caesar quickly discovered that warfare in Britain wasn't like warfare in Gaul. The shock of British chariots. The most striking feature of the British defense was its use of chariots. Now, by Caesar's time, most of the Mediterranean had grown out of chariot warfare. But on the misty plains of Britain, tribes made them terrifying. Swift two-horse chariots barreled toward Roman lines, warriors hurling javelins as the charioteer drove with skill. Then, like an ancient drive-by shooting, the fighter would dismount, fight hand to hand, and leap back onto the moving chariot to retreat. Romans were rattled. These weren't lumbering chariots from old Homeric tales but mobile skirmish machines, weaving in and out, harassing disciplined legions. Against Gauls, Caesar's formations worked brilliantly. Against whirlwinds of chariots, the test was harder, but as always, Roman discipline adapted. The legions tightened up, shields locked, presenting a different kind of obstacle. Chariots might harass, but they couldn't break a wall of iron. Tribal politics. Victory over chariots wasn't enough, though. To control Britain, Caesar had to play politics. And, surprise, Britain was every bit as divided as Gaul. Dozens of tribal kings and chieftains jockeyed for influence, some ready to defect, others determined to fight. The biggest resistance came from Cassivellaunus, a powerful tribal leader who united many groups in opposition to Rome. Cassivellaunus waged guerrilla warfare, melting into forests and marshes, avoiding open battle. His horsemen and chariots darted out, raiding supplies, then vanished again. Caesar responded with relentless marches, burning villages, seizing hostages, and rallying defectors. Piece by piece, Britain fractured in front of him. Eventually, Cassivellaunus was betrayed by rival tribes, just as Gauls always betrayed each other. Facing starvation and collapse, he submitted, suing for peace, anticlimax, and withdraw land. Caesar left, yes, despite 2 daring invasions, despite the spectacle, despite winning over some tribes. Caesar had no ability to properly occupy Britain. Winter was coming, his supply chains were stretched thin, and rebellions were brewing back in Gaul. He secured hostages, extracted vague promises of tribute, and marched his legions back across the Channel. Rome wouldn't actually conquer Britain for nearly a century after Caesar, when Emperor Claudius launched a full invasion in 43 CE. So in practical terms, Caesar's British adventures achieved almost nothing. But practicality wasn't what Caesar was chasing. Caesar, the celebrity, here's the genius. Back in Rome, the facts didn't matter. The perception did. And Caesar was a master of perception. He wrote glowing accounts of his British expedition, playing up the first Roman to reach Britain angle like a modern explorer planting flags on the moon. He described the mysterious islanders, their fierce painted bodies, their strange chariots and customs. Romans lapped it up. This wasn't a dry campaign in Gaul anymore. It was a story straight out of myth. Caesar had gone beyond the edge of the known world and returned with tales of strange peoples. It didn't matter whether he actually conquered Britain. To the Roman public, he was already a celebrity, an adventurer, a man touching the horizon. The Senate, meanwhile, squirmed. Every new report added to Caesar's untouchable aura of greatness. His enemies knew when he eventually came back from Gaul, he wouldn't just be some general. They would be facing a superstar with armies who idolized him. Curtain also. What was Britain for Caesar? Not conquest, not tribute, not empire at least, not yet. It was a stage, 2 invasions written into his commentaries, 2 crossings through the mist, 2 moments that lifted him out of ordinary politics and into legend. Gaul gave Caesar his wars. Britain gave him his celebrity. But Britain was a distraction. Back across the Channel, Gaul was seething again. New rebellions, new disasters, and a fiery leader, Ambiorix, were about to thrust Caesar into some of his darkest moments yet. The glory of Britain would soon give way to the blood of betrayal on Gallic soil. Chapter 7. The Eburones and the Great Ambush. By 54 BCE, Julius Caesar must have been feeling invincible. He'd faced migrating Helvetii, arrogant Germans, the nervy, and even blue-painted Britons in their chariots. Each time, he came back to Gaul with his legend bigger than before. But invincibility has a way of breeding overconfidence. And in Gaul, the tribes were watching, waiting for their opening. When it came, it wouldn't be on some open battlefield where Roman discipline thrived. It would be in the tangled forests, in the element of surprise, where Caesar's own legions least expected it, and the man who would deal Rome one of its grimmest defeats was a Gallic leader named Ambiorix. Gaul, in revolt Caesar's huge campaigns had drained. Gaul of patience. Tribes sick of paying tribute, losing hostages, and feeding legions decided they'd had enough. The tension boiled over in northern Gaul in 54 BCE among the Eburones, a Belgic tribe living near modern Belgium. Their chieftain, Ambiorix, was no ordinary noble. He was clever, charismatic, and ruthless. He didn't want to fight Rome in pitched battle that had gone badly for too many others. Instead, he would use cunning, and he found his chance at Roman overconfidence. The winter camps, with winter approaching. Caesar split his army into separate winter camps across Gaul, risky but necessary move to feed so many troops from scattered resources. He himself stayed further south, leaving his lieutenants, Quintus Titurius, Sabinus, and Lucius Aurunculeius Cotta, stationed with about 6,000 men near a fort at Achuatuca in Eburoni territory. Now, the Roman legions were formidable when massed together, but scattering them to forage and quarter for winter meant each camp was a target on its own. Caesar may have trusted his reputation too much, imagining no tribe would dare strike now. Ambiorix, though, saw vulnerability. Ambiorix's trick first. Ambiorix approached cunningly under the mask of friendship. He invited Roman officers to parley, speaking of loyalty, gratitude, and false warnings. The Germans, he claimed, were planning a massive invasion across the Rhine. His tribe, he swore, was loyal to Rome, but he himself was pressured to join the plot. Then he drove the dagger in. Ambiorix advised the Romans to abandon their exposed camp and march quickly to a safer stronghold. He even promised a safe corridor through his lands for their retreat. It was all a lie. Sabinus, nervous about being isolated, bought the story. His colleague, Cotta, disagreed. Better to hold steady in their defenses until Caesar himself returned. But Ambiorix's warnings rattled Sabinus, and soon the debate tilted his way. The Romans packed up, loaded the baggage train, and prepared to march. They had just walked into the trap. The ambush at Achuachacath, Roman column wound through wooded valleys, baggage carts creaking, soldiers cramped along narrow paths. Suddenly, from the hills and forests, the Eburones struck. Darts and javelins poured down, echoing war cries booming through the woods. The Romans were caught in marching order, not in battle formation exactly as Ambiorix planned. Panic spread as wagons clogged the routes. Leadership faltered. Sabinus, in shock, called again to negotiate. Ambiorix played him further, feigning goodwill before unleashing more attacks. Cotta tried to rally the men into cohesive squares of defense, but in the chaos, orders shattered. For hours, the Romans fought back desperately. Legionaries formed makeshift walls of shields, trying to repel wave after wave of warriors. But pressed on all sides, casualties mounted. Supplies broke. Cohesion collapsed. By nightfall, the camp was swarmed. Sabinus was lured into yet another parley only to be cut down in betrayal. Cotta, wounded, fell soon after. The remnants of the legion were butchered. Of 6,000 men, almost none escaped. One of Rome's proud legions had been utterly wiped out. Caesar's shock when word of the ambush reached Caesar. It must have felt like a gut punch. For a general who prided himself on discipline, foresight, and brilliance, this was a humiliating stain. Thousands of his men, not in a glorious stand, but in a deception that turned colleagues into corpses. Worse, it emboldened other tribes. If Ambiorix could destroy a legion, maybe Rome wasn't invincible after all. In one stroke, Ambiorix had shown Gaul a glimpse of freedom, and Caesar, furious, unleashed the cold wrath of Rome. Caesar's retribution. The fury with which Caesar responded marks a turning point in the Gallic Wars. No more patience, no more gentlemanly sparing. He turned to pure devastation, rushing north with his remaining legions. Caesar struck at tribe after tribe involved in the rising rebellion. Settlements were stormed, burned, and their inhabitants cut down. Villages that had cheered Ambiorix's success were left smoking ruins. The Eburones themselves faced extermination. Caesar ordered their fields stripped bare, homes torched, livestock stolen, and anyone left alive slaughtered or enslaved. He even called surrounding tribes traditional enemies of the Eburones to join the destruction, encouraging them to plunder freely. It was less a campaign than a scorched earth invitation to genocide. The Eburones, as a people, practically disappeared from history after Caesar. Their name survived, but their tribe was shattered beyond recovery. Caesar wanted Ambiorix's rebellion to be so terrifyingly punished that no tribe would dare repeat it. And Ambiorix himself, he vanished into the forests. Legends say he never fell into Roman hands, escaping across the Rhine with a handful of warriors. He became more myth than manna, constant reminder to Caesar and Rome that not every enemy could be caught. The darker turned. The Ambiorix ambush was Caesar's worst defeat in Gaul, but paradoxically, it strengthened his legend. When back home, he wrote the story in his commentaries. He framed it not as his miscalculation, but as Roman officers foolishly deceived by barbarian lies. The defeat became another chance to showcase his ruthless resolve in avenging Roman honor for the Gallic Wars overall. The massacre changed the tone. Gone were the days of flashy stunts like Rhine bridges or British raiding parties. Now, the conflict became grim, personal, bloody. Caesar was no longer playing games on tour. He was fighting for dominance that would only be secured by annihilation. Ambiorix might have won a fleeting victory, but in doing so, he unleashed Rome's full savagery. Legacy of the ambush in Roman history. The ambush of Atuatuca became a cautionary tale. Disaster comes when discipline is ignored and rash decisions overrule prudence. Sabinus, who trusted Ambiorix and pushed to retreat, was painted as cowardly and gullible. Cotta, the one who argued to stay fortified, was remembered with respect but ultimately powerless. For modern historians, it's a reminder of something deeper. The Gauls weren't faceless barbarians. Leaders like Ambiorix masterminded complex strategies, psychological tricks, and devastating ambushes. Rome learned painfully that cunning could sting as much as swords. Caesar himself, writing the tale, twisted it into propaganda. Romans died, yes, but the end lesson was Caesar's indomitable vengeance. And it worked. Back in Rome, citizens gasped at the betrayal, then cheered Caesar's merciless retaliation. His legend grew darker, sharper, deadlier. Curtain close on Ambiorix's ambush was the crack in Caesar's story of invincibility, the moment when Gaul struck back and nearly unseated Rome's grip. But in the end, instead of weakening him, it only unleashed a harsher Roman war machine. The Eburones were obliterated, Gaul trembled, and Caesar learned how to spin even disaster into his own myth. Yet Gaul's spirit wasn't dead. In the shadows of these abuses, new fires were smoldering. A greater leader, one who could unite Gaul completely, was about to step into history. A man whose name, Vercingetorix, would thunder across the stage as Caesar's most formidable rival. Chapter 8. Divide and Conquer. Tribal Politics in Gaultha. Story of Rome's conquest of Gaul is not just one of swords and shields. It's a tale of cunning, betrayal, and political games. Julius Caesar, a master strategist, didn't just fight battles, he waged a war of wits. Gaul, a land of fierce warriors and proud tribes, was a giant compared to Rome's small but disciplined army. Yet, Caesar turned Gaul's strength, its vast numbers and sprawling territories, into its greatest weakness. How? By exploiting the deep divisions between Gaul's tribes. This is the story of how Rome used alliances, bribes, and hostages to shatter Gaul's unity and claim victory. Gaul wasn't a single nation. Picture a patchwork quilt, hundreds of tribes, each with its own leaders, customs, and grudges. From the rolling hills of modern-day France to parts of Belgium, Switzerland, and Germany, Gaul was a land of diversity. Tribes like the Arverni, Aedui, and Sequani held sway over their own corners, but they rarely saw eye to eye. Some tribes were rich, controlling trade routes along rivers like the Rhine. Others were warlike, always ready to raid their neighbors. These differences weren't just cultural, they were political dynamite, waiting for someone like Caesar to light the fuse. Caesar arrived in Gaul, a Roman general with a knack for strategy. He saw the cracks in Gaul's unity and knew exactly how to exploit them. The tribes didn't trust each other. Old rivalries, territorial disputes, and competing ambitions kept them at odds. To Caesar, this was an opportunity. A united Gaul could have overwhelmed Rome's forces with sheer numbers, but a divided Gaul, that was a different story. Caesar's first move was to pick his allies carefully. He didn't need to win over every tribe, just enough to tip the balance. The Aedui, a powerful tribe in central Gaul, became his early partners. They were influential, friendly to Rome, and eager to gain an edge over their rivals. Caesar offered them protection, trade deals, and the promise of power. In return, they gave him troops, supplies, and local knowledge. But Caesar wasn't loyal to the Aedui out of friendship. It was pure strategy. By backing one tribe, he gained a foothold to challenge others. The Aedui's rivals, like the Remi and the Sequani, took notice. Some tribes saw the writing on the wall and joined Caesar to avoid being left out. Others resisted, suspicious of Rome's intentions. Caesar played both sides, offering gifts to cooperative leaders while sending warnings to those who defied him. A friendly tribe might receive Roman wine, weapons, or gold. A stubborn tribe might find its villages burned as an example. This wasn't just war, it was psychological warfare, designed to keep Gaul guessing. Caesar's toolbox went beyond alliances. He used bribes to sway tribal leaders, offering wealth and status to those who played along. A chieftain who swore loyalty might receive a Roman title or a fat purse of coins. It was hard to say no when your enemy was getting the same offer. But Caesar's bribes came with strings attached. He often demanded hostages, usually the sons or daughters of tribal leaders, to ensure loyalty. These hostages were treated well in Roman camps, educated in Roman ways, and sometimes even befriended. But they were also insurance policies. If a tribe betrayed Caesar, their loved ones paid the price. This tactic sowed fear and mistrust. Tribes hesitated to unite against Rome, knowing their hostages could suffer. A chieftain might want to fight, but the thought of his child in Roman hands could change his mind. Caesar's hostage system turned families into leverage, breaking the will of even the fiercest warriors. It was ruthless, but it worked. Gaul's tribes, already divided by old grudges, grew even more suspicious of each other. Who could trust a neighbor whose son was dining with Caesar? Caesar's greatest weapon was the tribes themselves. He didn't need to defeat every warrior in Gaul, just enough to let the tribes do the rest. He'd arm one tribe to fight another, promising rewards to the victor. The Arverni might attack the Helvetii, believing Rome would back them. Meanwhile, Caesar would sit back, letting his enemies weaken each other. When the dust settled, he'd march in with his legions to restore order, claiming more territory for Rome. One famous example was the rivalry between the Aedui and the Sequani. The Sequani, resentful of the Aedui's power, sought help from a Germanic warlord named Ariovistus. Caesar saw his chance. He allied with the Aedui, defeated Ariovistus, and crushed the Sequani's hopes. The Aedui cheered, thinking they'd won. But in truth, Caesar had just tightened Rome's grip on both tribes. By pitting them against each other, he ensured neither could challenge him. This was divide and conquer, at its finest, turning Gaul's strength into chaos. Rome's army was small compared to Gaul's population, Gaul could field hundreds of thousands of warriors, while Caesar's legions numbered in the tens of thousands. But numbers didn't matter when Gaul couldn't unite. Caesar's legions were professional, disciplined, and loyal to one man. Gaul's warriors were brave but disorganized, often fighting for personal glory or tribal pride. Caesar exploited this, striking tribes one at a time, never giving them a chance to band together. His campaigns were lightning fast. He'd march his legions through brutal terrain, build bridges in a day, and strike before the enemy could prepare. When tribes tried to rally, Caesar's spies, often Gauls paid or coerced into betrayal, would tip him off. He'd sow discord with rumors or bribes, ensuring no coalition could form. The Gauls were fierce, but they were no match for a united Roman machine fueled by their own divisions. The consequences of Gaul's disunity were staggering. Entire tribes were wiped out, their lands absorbed into Rome's empire. Those who survived often became Roman subjects, their cultures slowly fading under Roman rule. The Gauls' divisions, exploited by Caesar's cunning, made their defeat almost inevitable. A united Gaul might have stopped Rome, but mistrust and rivalry left them vulnerable. Caesar's conquest wasn't just about military might. It was about understanding human nature. He knew pride, greed, and fear could tear people apart. He used alliances to gain trust, bribes to buy loyalty, and hostages to enforce it. Every move was calculated to keep the tribes fighting each other instead of Rome. The Gauls were warriors, but Caesar was a chess player, and Gaul was his board. The fall of Gaul is a lesson in the power of division. Julius Caesar, with a smaller army and a foreign culture, didn't just conquer a land, he conquered its people by turning them against each other. Alliances, bribes, and hostages were his weapons, as sharp as any sword. Gaul's tribes were strong, but their fractured politics were no match for Rome's ruthless unity. This chapter of history shows how even the mightiest can fall when they stand alone. Caesar's legacy in Gaul is a reminder: unity is strength, and division is defeat. Chapter 9. Revolt after revolt. The conquest of Gaul wasn't a quick victory for Julius Caesar. It was a long, grueling struggle marked by endless uprisings. Just when Caesar thought he had a region under control, another tribe would rise up in rebellion. From the southwestern lands of Aquitania to the rugged coasts of Armorica in the northwest, revolts flared up like wildfires. Caesar and his legions dashed from one hotspot to the next, crushing each rebellion with brutal efficiency. But the Gauls' spirit never broke. Their constant resistance showed that Gaul wouldn't surrender without a fight. This is the story of how the Gauls kept rising time and again, forcing Rome to pay a heavy price for every inch of territory. Gaul was a vast territory, stretching from the Mediterranean to the English Channel and from the Rhine River to the Atlantic Ocean. It was home to dozens of tribes, each with its own warriors, traditions, and fierce independence. Caesar's initial campaigns in 58 and 57 BC had subdued many of these tribes, but resentment simmered beneath the surface. The Romans demanded tribute, took hostages, and stationed legions in Gallic lands. To the Gauls, this was an insult to their freedom. They were proud people, skilled in battle, and they weren't about to bow to foreign invaders. As Caesar pushed deeper into Gaul, the sparks of rebellion ignited into full-blown revolts. One of the first major uprisings came in 56 BC, along the Atlantic coast in Armorica, what we now call Brittany. The Veneti tribe, known for their seafaring skills, had grown tired of Roman demands. They captured Roman officers who were collecting supplies and called on neighboring tribes to join them. The Veneti had a powerful fleet of ships, built strong, with oak hulls and leather sails, perfect for the rough seas. They fortified their coastal towns on high cliffs, thinking the Romans couldn't touch them. But Caesar wasn't one to back down. He ordered his men to build a fleet of their own and launched a naval campaign. The decisive battle happened in the Bay of Morbihan. The Veneti ships outnumbered the Romans, but Caesar's engineers had a trick up their sleeve. They used long poles with hooks to cut the Veneti's rigging, leaving their ships helpless in the wind. One by one, the Gallic vessels were boarded and captured. The Veneti surrendered, but Caesar showed no mercy. He executed their leaders and sold the survivors into slavery. It was a harsh lesson meant to deter others. Yet, even as Armorica fell quiet, trouble brewed elsewhere. At the same time, in the southwest, Aquitania erupted in revolt. Tribes like the Sociates, Phocates, and Tarasates resisted Roman advances. Caesar sent his young lieutenant, Publius Crassus, to handle it. Crassus faced fierce opposition. The Gauls used guerrilla tactics, ambushing Roman columns in dense forests and swamps. But the Romans adapted, launching surprise attacks and cutting off supplies. In one key battle, the Gauls charged with their cavalry, but Roman discipline held the line. Crassus forced the tribes to surrender, securing Aquitania for Rome. Caesar praised his subordinate, but he knew this was just the beginning. The Gauls' defeats only fueled their desire for revenge. By 54 BC, Caesar's ambitions took him across the Channel to Britain, but he left his legions wintering in Gaul. This proved to be a mistake. A poor harvest that year left the Gauls hungry and angry. The Eburones tribe, led by the clever chieftain Ambiorix, saw their chance. Ambiorix tricked two Roman commanders, Sabinus and Cotta, into leaving their fortified camp with promises of safe passage. It was a trap. In a narrow valley, the Gauls ambushed the Romans, slaughtering nearly an entire legion. Word of this victory spread like wildfire, inspiring other tribes to rebel. The Nervi and other Belgae tribes joined in, besieging another Roman camp under Quintus Cicero. The Gauls built siege works and hurled fireballs, but Cicero's men held out. Caesar, hearing the news, rushed back from Italy with a small force. He marched his troops day and night, covering hundreds of miles in record time. Arriving just in time, he relieved the siege and routed the Gauls in a fierce battle. Ambiorix escaped, but Caesar wasn't done. He spent the winter hunting down rebels, burning villages, and taking no prisoners. The revolt was crushed, but the cost was high, thousands dead on both sides. The year 53 BC brought more unrest. The Treveri tribe, under Indutiomarus, rose up in the east, near the Rhine. They allied with Germanic tribes across the river, hoping to overwhelm the Romans. Caesar responded with speed and savagery. He crossed into Germanic territory to intimidate them, building a bridge over the Rhine in just 10 days, a feat of engineering that stunned everyone. Back in Gaul, his lieutenant Titus Labianus defeated the Treveri by luring them into a bad position. Indutiomarus was killed, and the tribe submitted. Caesar raided far and wide, destroying crops and homes to break the Gauls' will. It worked for a time, but the embers of rebellion still glowed. Then came the biggest challenge of all. In 52 BC, the Great Revolt, led by Vercingetorix. This young Arverni chieftain united tribes from across Gaul, something no one had done before. Tired of Roman oppression, Vercingetorix adopted a strategy, burning towns and fields to deny supplies to Caesar's army. He won a major victory at Gergovia, where the Romans suffered heavy losses trying to storm the Hilfort. Gauls everywhere cheered, and more warriors flocked to his banner. Caesar, outnumbered, retreated but regrouped. Vercingetorix holed up in the stronghold of Alesia with 80,000 men. Caesar surrounded it with massive fortifications, walls, ditches, and traps stretching for miles. When a huge Gallic relief army arrived, epic battles raged on two fronts. The Gauls attacked relentlessly, but Roman engineering and discipline prevailed. Starving and desperate, Vercingetorix surrendered, throwing down his arms at Caesar's feet. The revolt collapsed, with survivors scattered or enslaved. It was a turning point, but not the end. Even after Alesia, pockets of resistance persisted. In 51 BC, in the southwest near Uxellodunum, chieftains Draps and Lucterius rallied the Cadurci and other tribes. They fortified the town on a steep hill, stocked with supplies. Caesar's general Caninius Rebilus besieged it, but the Gauls held out. Caesar arrived personally, cut off their water supply by tunneling under the hill, and forced a surrender. To make an example, he ordered the hands of the fighters chopped off, a gruesome punishment to discourage future rebels. By 50 BC, the last holdouts were mopped up, and Gaul was finally pacified. These revolts took a toll on Caesar. His legions were stretched thin, marching endlessly from one crisis to another. Supplies ran low, morale dipped, and casualties mounted. Yet Caesar's genius shone through. He used speed, intelligence from spies, and innovative tactics to stay one step ahead. The Gauls fought bravely with ambushes, sieges, and massive armies, but their disunity often doomed them. Each time a revolt was crushed, Caesar imposed harsher terms. But the Gauls' defiance never fully died. The story of these revolts is one of resilience. The Gauls rose again and again, from Aquitania's forests to Armorica's shores, proving they wouldn't go quietly. Caesar's victory came at a steep price. Estimates say up to 1 million Gauls died or were enslaved. But their resistance shaped history, forcing Rome to commit more resources and ultimately leading to Gaul's integration into the empire. Caesar emerged as a hero in Rome, but the Gauls' spirit of freedom echoed through the ages. This chapter reminds us that conquest is never easy when facing a people determined to fight for their homeland. In the end, Gaul fell, but not without teaching Rome the true cost of empire. Chapter 10, Vercingetorix, the hero, emerges in the heart of Gaul. A young warrior named Vercingetorix stepped onto the stage of history, changing the course of Rome's conquest. As chieftain of the Arverni tribe, he was no ordinary leader. His charisma, vision, and unyielding determination sparked a fire that for the first time united the fractured tribes of Gaul against Julius Caesar. What had been a series of scattered rebellions became a full-scale war. Vercingetorix wasn't just a rebel, he was a hero who made Caesar sweat. This is the story of how a young man rose to challenge an empire, turning the fight for Gaul into a battle for the ages. Gaul, in 52 BC, was a land battered by years of Roman campaigns. Tribes had been subdued, leaders bribed or killed, and Roman legions seemed unstoppable. The Gauls were proud but divided, their rivalries exploited by Caesar's cunning. Many had lost hope, resigned to Roman rule, but not Vercingetorix. Born into the Arverni, a powerful tribe in central Gaul, he was young, likely in his 20s, yet carried the weight of a seasoned leader. Tall, commanding, with a fire in his eyes, he had a gift for inspiring loyalty. His people saw something special in him, a spark that could ignite a nation. Vercingetorix's rise wasn't easy. His own tribe was split. Some leaders, including his uncle Gobernitio, favored peace with Rome, fearing the consequences of defiance. But Vercingetorix saw surrender as betrayal. He spoke of freedom, of Gaul's right to its own destiny. His words stirred the hearts of warriors and common folk alike. When the Arverni elders hesitated, he took matters into his own hands. Gathering a band of loyal followers, he seized control of the tribe's capital, Gergovia, in a bold move that shocked his rivals. The elders had no choice but to rally behind him. Vercingetorix was now the leader of the Arverni, but his ambitions were far bigger. What set Vercingetorix apart was his vision. He understood that Gaul's strength. For years, tribes had fought alone, easily picked off by Caesar's disciplined legions. Vercingetorix changed that. He traveled across Gaul, from the mountains of the Auvergne to the plains of the north, meeting with chieftains of tribes like the Aedui, Senones, and Parisii. His charisma was magnetic. He spoke of a shared cause, a Gaul free from Roman chains. He didn't just ask for allies, he demanded commitment, urging tribes to set aside old grudges for the sake of their homeland. His message worked. Tribe after tribe pledged their warriors, something no Gaulish leader had achieved before. The Aedui, once Rome's allies, broke ranks to join him. The Carnets, Bituriges, and others followed. Vercingetorix forged a coalition that stretched across Gaul, uniting tens of thousands under one banner. It wasn't just his words that won them over, it was his actions. He shared their hardships, fought alongside them, and showed he wasn't just a talker. To the Gauls, he was a hero, a symbol of hope in their darkest hour. With unity came strategy. Vercingetorix wasn't just a warrior. He was a thinker who could match Caesar's cunning. He knew the Romans relied on supplies to keep their legions fed and moving. So he adopted a scorched earth policy, ordering villages and fields burned to starve the invaders. It was a painful choice. Gauls watched their homes and crops go up in flames, but Vercingetorix convinced them it was necessary. He trained his warriors to fight smarter, using hit-and-run tactics to harass Roman columns. He avoided open battles where Rome's disciplined formations would win, instead striking fast and fading into the forests. The war turned serious at Gergovia, the Arverni stronghold. Caesar, sensing the growing threat, marched to crush Vercingetorix before his coalition could solidify. Gergovia sat atop a steep hill, surrounded by rugged terrain, a natural fortress. Caesar laid siege, confident his legions could storm it. But Vercingetorix was ready. He rallied his warriors, using the high ground to rain down spears and stones. When Caesar's troops climbed the slopes, they were met with fierce resistance. The Gauls fought with a fury Rome hadn't seen before, united under their young leader's command. The battle was a disaster for Caesar. His legions were pushed back, suffering heavy losses, some say up to 700 men, a rare defeat for the general. Vercingetorix's victory sent shockwaves through Gaul. Tribes that had wavered now flocked to his side, inspired by his success. For the first time, Caesar faced a real challenge. The Gauls weren't just rebelling, they were fighting as one, led by a man who could outthink and outfight Rome's best. Caesar later admitted Gergovia was a mistake, a sign he'd underestimated his opponent. But Vercingetorix's greatest test came at Alesia, a hilltop fortress in eastern Gaul. After Gergovia, he gathered an army of 80,000 warriors, a massive force by any measure. Caesar pursued, determined to end the uprising. Vercingetorix fortified Alesia, believing it could withstand a siege. Caesar, however, had other plans. He surrounded the town with an incredible network of walls, ditches, and traps, miles of fortifications built in weeks. It was a masterpiece of Roman engineering, designed to trap Vercingetorix inside. The Gauls didn't give up. Vercingetorix sent messengers to rally a relief army, and tribes from across Gaul answered the call. Soon, a second foursome, say as many as 250,000 strong, arrived to break the siege. Caesar was now caught between two armies, Vercingetorix inside Alesia and the relief force outside. The battles that followed were epic. The Gauls attacked day and night, hurling themselves at Roman defenses. Vercingetorix led charges from within, coordinating with the relief army to overwhelm Caesar's lines. For a moment, it seemed the Gauls might win. They breached parts of the Roman fortifications, and Caesar's smaller force was stretched to the breaking point. But Caesar's genius shone through. He personally led a counterattack, rallying his men at critical moments. Roman discipline held, and their defenses proved too strong. The relief army faltered, exhausted and disorganized. Inside Alesia, food ran out, and starvation set in. Vercingetorix faced a heartbreaking choice: keep fighting and risk his people's lives, or surrender to save them. In a moment that echoed through history, Vercingetorix chose to surrender. He rode out of Alesia, clad in his finest armor, and laid his weapons at Caesar's feet. It was a gesture of defiance and dignity, showing he was no coward. His warriors wept, and even some Romans admired his courage. Taken to Rome in chains, Vercingetorix was imprisoned for years before being executed in Caesar's triumph. His defeat marked the end of Gaul's greatest rebellion, but his legacy endured. The rise of Vercingetorix turned a Roman conquest into a true war. His charisma united a divided people, giving them a taste of victory at Gergovia. His vision made Gaul a nation, if only for a moment. At Alesia, he came closer than anyone to breaking Rome's grip, forcing Caesar to fight harder than ever before. The Gauls' defeat wasn't just about numbers, it was about resources, discipline, and a bit of luck favoring Rome. Vercingetorix was a hero who showed what Gaul could be: fierce, united, and unbreakable in spirit. This chapter of history is a testament to one man's ability to inspire. Vercingetorix took a fractured land and gave it purpose, proving that even against an empire, a single leader can make a difference. Caesar may have won, but he never forgot the young chieftain who made him earn every victory. Gaul fell, but Vercingetorix's name lived on, a symbol of resistance and the enduring fight for freedom. Chapter 11. Scorched Earth. The Gallic counter-strategy. 52 BC. The war for Gaul reached a turning point. Vercingetorix, the young Arverni chieftain, had united the tribes into a force that could challenge Rome, but he knew brute strength alone wouldn't defeat Julius Caesar's disciplined legions. Instead, he unveiled a bold and brutal strategy: scorched earth. By burning their own towns and fields, the Gauls aimed to starve Caesar's army, cutting off the supplies that kept Rome's war machine running. This wasn't a war of grand battles, it was a grinding war of attrition, forcing Caesar to fight not just warriors, but hunger and desperation. For the first time, logistics became as critical as swords in the conquest of Gaul. Vercingetorix understood his enemy. Caesar's legions were a marvel, professional, well-trained, and relentless. But they had a weakness. They needed food, fodder for horses, and supplies to keep moving. Gaul's vast lands provided plenty of resources, with fertile fields, stocked granaries, and villages full of provisions. Roman foraging parties roamed the countryside, collecting grain and livestock to sustain their campaigns. Vercingetorix saw this as Rome's lifeline, and he decided to cut it. His plan was simple but ruthless: destroy everything the Romans could use, leaving them stranded in a wasteland. The scorched earth strategy was a hard sell. Gauls were proud of their land's lush valleys, thriving farms, and fortified towns passed down through generations. Burning them meant sacrificing their homes, their livelihoods, and their future. Vercingetorix traveled from tribe to tribe, his charisma on full display, convincing chieftains and warriors alike that this was their only chance. He argued that short-term pain would lead to long-term victory. If the Romans starved, they'd have to retreat or face defeat. His passion won them over, and soon fires lit up the Gallic countryside as tribes set their own fields ablaze. The strategy began in central Gaul, where Vercingetorix's Arverni and their allies held sway. Entire villages went up in flames, huts, barns, and grain stores reduced to ash. Farmers drove their livestock into the hills or slaughtered them to keep them from Roman hands. Fields of wheat and barley, ripe for harvest, were torched before foraging parties could arrive. The smoke was visible for miles, a grim signal of Gaul's defiance. For the Gauls, it was heartbreaking. Families watched their homes burn, knowing they'd face hunger alongside their enemies. But Vercingetorix's vision gave them purpose. Every fire was a blow against Rome. Caesar felt the impact immediately. His legions, numbering in the tens of thousands, needed vast amounts of food daily. Without local supplies, they relied on long, vulnerable supply lines stretching back to Roman territories. Vercingetorix targeted these, sending cavalry to ambush wagons and cut off reinforcements. The Gauls avoided open battles, where Rome's disciplined formations would crush them. Instead, they fought a shadow war: hit-and-run attacks, nighttime raids, and traps in forests and marshes. Vercingetorix's warriors were fast, knowing the terrain like the back of their hands, and they struck where the Romans were weakest. This war of attrition tested Caesar like never before. His earlier campaigns had relied on speed and decisive victories, But now he was bogged down in a hostile land with dwindling resources. His men grew tired, their rations thin. Horses, critical for cavalry and transport, weakened without fodder. Caesar's scouts reported devastation wherever they went: empty villages, blackened fields, and no trace of food. He knew he couldn't let his army starve, so he adapted. Logistics became his obsession. He tightened control over supply lines, sent larger foraging parties, and scouted for any unburned resources. One critical moment came early in the campaign, when Vercingetorix ordered the destruction of nearly 20 towns in the land of the Bituriges. The tribe begged to spare their capital, Avaricum, a well-fortified city with stores of grain. Vercingetorix reluctantly agreed, believing its walls could hold against a siege. Caesar saw his chance. He marched on Avaricum, surrounding it with his legions. The Gauls defended fiercely, hurling stones and boiling pitch from the walls. But Caesar's engineers built siege towers and ramps, inching closer each day. After weeks of brutal fighting, the Romans breached the walls, slaughtering nearly everyone inside, some say 40,000 people. The grain stores fell into Roman hands, a rare victory in the scorched earth campaign. The loss of Avaricum was a blow, but Vercingetorix learned from it. He doubled down on his strategy, refusing to let sentiment spare more towns. He rallied his coalition, urging them to burn faster and wider. From the Loire Valley to the plains of the north, Gaul became a charred landscape. The Gauls' sacrifice was immense, but it worked. Caesar's army grew weaker, forced to spread thin to find food. His men grumbled, and morale dipped. For the first time, the Romans felt the strain of a war they couldn't win with swords alone. Vercingetorix paired his scorched earth tactics with clever military moves. He used his cavalry to harass Roman foragers, cutting down stragglers and burning any supplies they missed. He fortified key strongholds, like Gergovia, where he'd already defeated Caesar. These hillforts, surrounded by steep slopes and thick walls, were hard to assault and easy to defend. Vercingetorix knew Caesar couldn't ignore them, but every siege drained Roman resources further. The Gauls fought to wear Rome down, betting that hunger would do what their spears could not. Caesar responded with ingenuity. He built fortified camps to protect his supplies and sent trusted lieutenants, like Titus Labionus, to secure distant regions. He scoured allied territories for grain, even if it meant straining relations with friendly tribes. When possible, he captured Gallic strongholds to seize their remaining stores. But the deeper he pushed into Gaul, the harder it got. The scorched earth slowed his advance, forcing him to rethink every move. Logistics, once a background task, became the heart of his campaign. Every march, every battle, hinged on keeping his men fed. The climax came at Alesia, where Vercingetorix made his stand. He fortified the hilltop town with 80,000 warriors, believing it could withstand Caesar's siege. But Caesar, desperate to end the rebellion, built an astonishing double wall, one to trap Vercingetorix inside, another to fend off a massive Gallic relief army. The scorched earth strategy had left Alesia's defenders with limited food, and starvation set in. Vercingetorix's plan had turned against him. His own tactics now trapped his people. When the relief army failed to break through and supplies ran out, he surrendered to save his warriors. The scorched earth strategy was a gamble that almost worked. Vercingetorix's vision transformed Gaul's war from scattered uprisings into a unified struggle. By burning their own lands, the Gauls forced Caesar to fight on their terms, making every step costly. The strategy's brutality showed their resolve. No sacrifice was too great for freedom. But Rome's adaptability, Caesar's cunning, and the sheer discipline of his legions proved too much. Alesia's fall marked the end of the rebellion, but not the end of Gaul's spirit. This chapter of history reveals the power of strategy over strength. Vercingetorix's scorched earth campaign turned Gaul's abundance into a weapon, pushing Caesar to the brink. It showed that war isn't just about battles, it's about outlasting your enemy. The Gauls' sacrifice was immense, their lands reduced to ash, their people starved alongside the Romans. Yet, their resistance forced Caesar to adapt, proving that even a mighty empire could be shaken by a determined foe. Vercingetorix's legacy lives on, not just as a warrior, but as a leader who made Rome fight for every victory in a land that refused to yield easily. Chapter 12. The Siege of Avaricum, the winter of 52 BC. Julius Caesar faced a critical moment in his conquest of Gaul. The young Arverni chieftain had united the tribes and launched a scorched earth campaign, burning fields and towns to starve the Roman legions. Food was scarce, morale was low, and Caesar needed a win, but a victory that would send a message to all of Gaul. He set his sights on Avaricum, one of the richest and best fortified cities of the Bituriges tribe. The siege that followed showcased the relentless power of Rome's war machine. When Avaricum fell, Caesar unleashed a horrific massacre, slaughtering tens of thousands. It was a chilling moment that revealed the brutal cost of defying Rome. Avaricum, in what is now central France, was a jewel of Gaul. Its strong walls, built of timber and stone, stood atop a hill surrounded by marshes and rivers, making it a natural fortress. The city was packed with grain, livestock, and wealth resources Caesar desperately needed to feed his hungry army. Vercingetorix had urged the Bituriges to burn Avaricum, as they had other towns, to deny Rome supplies. But the tribe refused, begging to defend their capital. They believed its defenses could hold against any attack. Vercingetorix reluctantly agreed, stationing warriors inside while he harassed the Romans from outside. For Caesar, Avaricum was more than a target, it was a chance to break Gaul's spirit. Caesar arrived with his legions, about 40,000 strong, and surveyed the city's formidable defenses. The walls were high, the terrain treacherous, and the Gauls were ready. But Caesar was driven by hunger, not just for food, but for a symbolic victory. Avaricum's wealth and prestige made it a prize worth taking. A win here would show the Gauls that no stronghold was safe, no matter how strong its walls. Caesar rallied his men, promising glory and spoils. Despite the bitter cold and dwindling supplies, the Romans set to work, their siege machine grinding into motion. The Romans were masters of siege warfare, and Avaricum saw their skills in full force. Caesar ordered his men to build a massive ramp, nearly 300 feet wide, to reach the city's walls. Soldiers hauled earth and timber, working day and night under a hail of Gallic arrows, stones, and boiling pitch. The Gauls fought fiercely from the ramparts, using slings and spears to slow the Romans' progress. They built wooden towers to match the Roman siege works, hurling firebrands to burn them down. Vercingetorix, camped nearby, sent cavalry to harass Roman foragers, trying to starve them out before they could breach the city. Caesar's engineers proved unstoppable. They constructed siege towers tall, mobile platforms that could be rolled up the ramp to the walls. To protect the workers, they built covered shelters called tortoises, made of wood and hides to deflect missiles. The Romans also dug tunnels to weaken Avaricum's foundations, a tactic the Gauls countered with their own underground passages. The defenders poured burning oil and pitch into Roman tunnels, setting them ablaze. For weeks, the siege was a brutal back and forth, with neither side giving an inch. The Gauls' courage matched the Romans' discipline, but Caesar's machine kept grinding forward. The Romans faced more than just arrows and fire. Winter rains turned the ground to mud, slowing their work. Food was so scarce that soldiers ate roots and scraps, their strength fading. Caesar himself walked among them, sharing their hardships to keep morale high. He knew time was against him. Vercingetorix's raids were cutting off supplies, and other tribes were watching. If Avaricum held out, it could inspire more rebellions. Caesar pushed his men harder, promising that the city's riches would be theirs. The Gauls, meanwhile, sent women and children to the walls to plead for mercy, hoping to soften Roman hearts. It didn't work. After nearly a month, the Roman ramp reached the walls. Caesar waited for the right moment, a stormy night, when rain and wind masked the sound of his troops. Under cover of darkness, he ordered a full assault. Legionaries climbed the siege towers and stormed the ramparts, catching the Gauls off guard. The defenders fought bravely, but the Romans' training and numbers overwhelmed them. Once inside, the legions poured through the streets, cutting down anyone in their path. The Gauls tried to flee, but the city's narrow gates became a death trap, choked with bodies. What followed was a bloodbath. Caesar, furious at the Gauls' resistance and desperate to send a message, gave his men free rein. The Romans, starved and exhausted, unleashed their rage. Men, women, and children, soldiers and civilians alike were slaughtered without mercy. Ancient sources claim up to 40,000 people died, though only a few hundred escaped. The streets ran red, and the city's wealth, grain, gold, and livestock fell into Roman hands. Avaricum, once a proud symbol of Gallic strength, was reduced to a smoldering ruin. The massacre wasn't just about vengeance. Caesar wanted to terrify Gaul into submission. Avaricum's fall was meant to show that no city, no matter how strong, could defy Rome. The grain stores fed his army, easing the pressure of Vercingetorix's scorched earth strategy. The victory boosted Roman morale, proving they could overcome even the toughest defenses. But it came at a cost. The slaughter hardened Gallic resolve, fueling Vercingetorix's call for unity. Tribes that had hesitated now joined him, outraged by the carnage. Avaricum's destruction was a win for Caesar, but it also set the stage for a bigger fight. Vercingetorix used the defeat to rally his coalition. He reminded the tribes that sparing Avaricum had been a mistake, one he'd warned against. He urged them to double down on burning their lands, ensuring the Romans would find nothing elsewhere. The loss of Avaricum stung, but it didn't break the Gauls. Instead, it strengthened their determination to fight under Vercingetorix's leadership. The war was far from over, and the next clash at Gergovia and later Alesia d'Est, both sides to their limits. For Caesar, Avaricum was the symbolic victory he craved. It showed his legions could conquer even the strongest Gallic cities, and it filled their bellies with desperately needed supplies. But the massacre left a dark stain. The sheer scale of the killing shocked even some Romans who saw it as excessive. Caesar justified it as necessary, a warning to other tribes. Yet, it revealed the brutal reality of his campaign. To win Gaul, he would spare no one who stood in his way. The siege machine that took Avaricum was more than wood and iron. It was a tool of terror, designed to break hearts as much as walls. The fall of Avaricum was a chilling moment in the Gallic War. It showed the power of Rome's military might, from siege towers to relentless discipline. It also exposed the cost of resistance dens, of thousands dead in a single night. For the Gauls, it was a tragedy that fueled their fight for freedom. For Caesar, it was a step toward victory, but one that came with a price. The massacre united his enemies, setting the stage for Vercingetorix's greatest stand. This chapter of history reminds us that conquest is never clean. Avaricum's ruins stood as a warning. Rome's hunger for victory could burn as fiercely as any Gallic fire, leaving nothing but ashes in its wake. Chapter 13. The Giant Fortress of Gergovion, the spring of 52 BC. Julius Caesar faced a turning point in his conquest of Gaul. Vercingetorix, the charismatic Arvernaud chieftain, had united the tribes and was waging a fierce resistance against Rome. After the brutal fall of Avaricum, Caesar needed another victory to restore his momentum. He turned his sights on Gergovia, the mountain stronghold of the Arverni and Vercingetorix's home base. But this time, Caesar's confidence betrayed him. The tough terrain, Gallic determination, and Roman missteps led to a shocking defeat, one of Caesar's rare humiliations. Gergovia cracked Rome's aura of invincibility, proving that even the mighty Caesar could falter. Gergovia was no ordinary city. Perched high on a rugged plateau in central Gaul, it was a natural fortress. Steep cliffs and rocky slopes guarded its approaches, with thick stone walls reinforcing the defenses. The Arverni had made it their capital, a symbol of their power and independence. Vercingetorix knew its strength and chose it as a stronghold to rally his coalition. Thousands of warriors from tribes across Gaul gathered there, inspired by his call for freedom. For Caesar, taking Gergovia would crush Vercingetorix's heartland and break the growing rebellion. He marched with his legions, determined to prove Rome's might. Caesar arrived with about 30,000 men, a formidable force, but smaller than the Gallic army entrenched above. The terrain was a nightmare. Steep hills, narrow paths, and dense forests favored the defenders. Vercingetorix had prepared well, stationing warriors along the ridges and fortifying key positions. His cavalry patrolled the plains below, harassing Roman scouts and foragers. Caesar's legions, still reeling from the scorched earth campaign that left them short on supplies, faced a daunting challenge. But Caesar was confident. His victories at Avaricum and elsewhere convinced him his legions could overcome any obstacle. The Romans set up camp at the base of the plateau, studying Gergovia's defenses. Caesar's plan was bold, a frontal assault to seize the city's walls. His engineers began building ramps and siege works, as they had at Avaricum, while his men endured constant attacks from Gallic skirmishers. Vercingetorix, ever cunning, avoided a direct battle. He used his knowledge of the terrain, sending warriors to strike from hidden paths and high ground. The Gauls hurled spears, rolled boulders, and launched surprise raids, making every Roman move costly. Caesar's men worked under fire, their progress slow and grueling. Caesar's confidence grew into overconfidence. He believed his legion's discipline would overpower the Gauls despite the odds. He spotted a weak point, a hill near Gergovia, held by fewer defenders, devised a plan to capture it as a staging ground. He sent a diversionary force to distract the Gauls, while his main army prepared to storm the walls. But Vercingetorix was one step ahead. His scouts, hidden in the hills, spotted the Roman movements. He reinforced the weak hill and rallied his warriors, turning Caesar's plan into a trap. The battle began with a Roman feint, drawing Gallic attention to one side of the plateau. Caesar then launched his main attack, sending legions up the steep slopes toward Gergovia's walls. The climb was brutal. Soldiers struggled under heavy armor, slipping on loose rocks while arrows and stones rained down. The Gauls fought with fierce resolve, inspired by Vercingetorix's presence. Women and children joined the defense, hurling rocks and shouting defiance from the ramparts. The Romans reached the walls, but the Gauls counterattacked. Caesar's legions, spread thin across the rugged terrain, lost their cohesion. The narrow paths and steep cliffs broke their formations, leaving them vulnerable. Vercingetorix's warriors, fighting for their homeland, struck with precision. They targeted Roman officers, sowing confusion, and pushed the invaders back down the slopes. Caesar's diversionary force, led by his lieutenant Titus Labienus, was cut off and overwhelmed. The Romans fought bravely, but the Gauls' numbers and terrain advantage proved too much. Caesar sounded the retreat, a rare admission of failure. The defeat was stunning. Ancient sources say the Romans lost nearly 700 men, including 46 centurions, veteran officers critical to the legion's discipline. The Gauls, by contrast, suffered fewer losses and held the city. Caesar's army limped back to their camp, battered and demoralized. For the first time, the Romans faced a united Gaul, led by a leader who could outmaneuver them. Vercingetorix's victory at Gergovia sent shockwaves across the region. Tribes that had wavered now flocked to his banner, swelling his army to tens of thousands. Gaul buzzed with hope, believing Rome could be beaten. Caesar later admitted his mistake. In his own writings, he blamed the defeat on his troops' overzealous charge, but the truth was deeper. His overconfidence had blinded him to Gergovia's challenges. The terrain favored the Gauls, and Vercingetorix's tactics exploited every advantage. Caesar underestimated the unity and spirit of his enemy, assuming his legion's reputation would carry the day. Instead, Gergovia exposed Rome's limits. The invincible war machine, which had crushed Avaricum and countless tribes, stumbled against a determined foe fighting on their own ground. The loss cracked Rome's aura of invincibility. Before Gergovia, many Gauls feared Caesar's legions were unbeatable. Now they saw a glimmer of victory. Vercingetorix seized the moment, rallying more tribes to his cause. The Aedui, once Rome's allies, defected to join him, angered by Caesar's relentless campaigns. Across Gaul, warriors sharpened their spears, inspired by the sight of Roman standards retreating. Vercingetorix's scorched earth strategy continued. burning more fields to starve the invaders. While his cavalry harried Caesar's supply lines, for Caesar, Gergovia was a wake-up call. He regrouped his legions, tightened discipline, and shifted his strategy. He knew he couldn't afford another loss. He abandoned the siege and marched north, drawing Vercingetorix into a new confrontation. The defeat forced him to focus on mobility and logistics, avoiding fortified strongholds where the Gauls held the advantage. Caesar's genius was in his adaptability. He learned from Gergovia, preparing for the decisive clash at Alesia. But the stain of defeat lingered, a rare mark on his record. For the Gauls, Gergovia was a moment of triumph. Vercingetorix proved he could beat Caesar, uniting his people like never before. The mountain fortress became a symbol of resistance, its walls standing firm against Rome's might. The victory showed that Gaul's spirit was unbroken, even after years of war and loss. Warriors sang of Gergovia around campfires, their hope rekindled. Yet the triumph was bittersweet. Vercingetorix knew the war was far from won, and Caesar's retreat was only temporary. This chapter of the Gallic War reveals the power of determination and terrain. Gergovia was more than a battle, it was a statement. Vercingetorix, with his mountain stronghold and united tribes, handed Caesar a rare humiliation. The Gauls' courage, paired with the unforgiving landscape, turned the tables on Rome's war machine. But the victory came with a warning. Caesar would not underestimate his enemy again. Gergovia cracked Rome's myth of invincibility. But it also set the stage for the final showdown at Alesia, where the fate of Gaul would be decided. The mountain fortress stood as a testament to what a united people could achieve, even against the mightiest empire. Chapter 14. Alesia, the decisive battle. In the fall of 52 BC, the Gallic War reached its climax at Alesia, a hilltop fortress in eastern Gaul. Vercingetorix, the Arverni chieftain who had united the tribes, made his final stand here, hoping to outlast Julius Caesar's legions. But Caesar answered with an engineering marvel, a massive double fortification that encircled Alesia, trapping the Gauls inside while fending off their allies outside. For weeks, the siege tested both sides with starvation, desperate battles, and sheer endurance. Caesar's army teetered on the brink, but Roman discipline and walls held firm. In the end, Vercingetorix surrendered in a dramatic act. Alesia was the decisive battle that sealed Gaul's fate. Alesia sat atop a steep hill, surrounded by rivers and rugged terrain, a stronghold built to withstand any attack. Vercingetorix retreated there with 80,000 warriors, believing its defenses and stored supplies could hold against a siege. His scorched earth campaign had starved Caesar's legions, and he hoped to outlast them. Tribes across Gaul rallied to his cause, sending a massive relief army to break the siege. For Alesia was the last chance to crush Rome and free his people. Caesar arrived with about 50,000 men, a smaller force but battle-hardened and fiercely loyal. He knew storming Alesia's walls would be costly, so he chose a different path, a siege to starve the Gauls out. But Vercingetorix's relief army was coming, and Caesar couldn't fight on two fronts without a plan. His solution was breathtaking, an engineering feat unmatched in history. He ordered his men to build a double fortification, an inner wall, 11 miles long, to trap Alesia's defenders, and an outer wall, 13 miles long, to protect against the relief army. These walls, studded with towers, ditches, and deadly traps, turned Alesia into a battlefield unlike any other. The Romans worked with relentless speed. Soldiers dug trenches, piled earth, and felled trees under constant attack from Gallic cavalry. They built wooden palisades, sharpened stakes, and hidden pits filled with spikes called lilies. Caesar's engineers designed the fortifications to channel attackers into kill zones, where archers and catapults could cut them down. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix watched the walls rise, knowing time was against him. His supplies, meant to last months, dwindled as 80,000 warriors and civilians packed the fortress. He sent out cavalry to summon help, urging tribes to send every fighter they could. Weeks of siege wore both sides down. Inside Alesia, food ran low, and starvation set in. Vercingetorix rationed what little remained, but children and the elderly suffered most. He expelled non-combatants, women, children, and the weak, hoping Caesar would let them pass and ease the strain. Caesar, cold and calculating, refused, leaving them to starve in no man's land between the walls. It was a cruel tactic, meant to break Gallic morale. But Vercingetorix held his warriors together, promising relief was near. Outside, the Gallic relief army arrived, some say as many as 250,000 strong, though likely closer to 100,000, led by chieftains like Camillus and Vercingetorix. They were a coalition of tribes, united by Vercingetorix's call. The sight of their banners lifted the spirits of Alesia's defenders. The Gauls launched a massive assault on Caesar's outer wall, while Vercingetorix led a breakout from within. The battles were ferocious. Waves of Gallic warriors charged the fortifications, braving arrows, spears, and traps. They climbed ditches and tore at palisades, desperate to break through. Inside, Vercingetorix's men attacked the inner wall, trying to link up with their allies. Caesar's army was stretched to its limit. The Romans fought on two fronts, outnumbered and exhausted. Their walls held, but only just. At critical moments, Caesar himself rode into the fray, rallying his men with shouts and gestures. His lieutenants, like Titus Labienus and Gaius Trebonius, led counterattacks, holding key points against overwhelming odds. The Gauls came close to victory, breaching parts of the outer wall in one desperate push. But Roman discipline, forged by years of training, kept the lines intact. Legionaries locked shields, repelled assaults, and repaired defenses under fire. The turning point came in a final, massive attack. The Gauls targeted a weak spot in the outer wall, a hill where the terrain made fortifications thinner. Vercingetorix coordinated from inside, launching a simultaneous assault. For a moment, it seemed the Romans would break. Caesar, sensing the crisis, made a daring move. He gathered his reserve cavalry, many of them Germanic allies, and led a flank attack on the relief army. The sudden charge caught the Gauls off guard, sowing panic. Labienus reinforced the weak point, and the Roman lines held. The relief army faltered, then fled, pursued by Caesar's cavalry. Thousands of Gauls fell, their hopes of breaking the siege shattered. Inside Alesia, the situation grew dire. Food was gone, and starvation claimed lives daily. Vercingetorix called a council of his warriors. He offered to surrender to save his people, a decision born of courage and despair. The Gauls agreed, trusting their leader to the end. In a moment etched into history, Vercingetorix rode out of Alesia, clad in his finest armor, his horse adorned with silver. He circled Caesar's camp, then dismounted and laid his weapons at Caesar's feet. It was a gesture of defiance and dignity, not defeat. He offered himself to spare his people, knowing Rome would show little mercy. Caesar accepted the surrender, sparing the survivors but enslaving most. Vercingetorix was taken in chains to Rome, where he would later be executed in Caesar's triumph. The fall of Alesia broke the Gallic rebellion. Tribes across Gaul, seeing their greatest hope defeated, began to submit. Caesar's victory was total, but it came at a cost. His army was battered, his supplies nearly gone. The double walls, a marvel of engineering, had saved him, but only through sheer grit and discipline. Alesia was more than a battle, it was a clash of wills. Vercingetorix's unity and courage pushed Caesar to the edge, forcing him to innovate and fight like never before. The Gauls' bravery, from the defenders inside to the relief army outside, showed their unbreakable spirit. But Rome's walls, strategy, and relentless discipline proved too much. The siege, lasting weeks, saw starvation, epic battles, and a final, heartbreaking surrender. Caesar emerged victorious, but Alesia's cost was staggering: tens of thousands dead, a nation subdued. This chapter of the Gallic War marks the end of Gaul's greatest stand. Vercingetorix's surrender was not just the fall of a leader, but the fall of a dreamer. United Gaul, free from Rome, Caesar's fortifications. A testament to Roman ingenuity, turned the tide. But the Gauls' resistance left a mark. Alesia's hills bore witness to a people who fought to their last breath, led by a hero who gave everything for his homeland. The battle sealed Rome's conquest, but it also immortalized Vercingetorix as a symbol of defiance, his final act echoing through history as a testament to courage in the face of an empire. Chapter 15: The Aftermath and Legacy of the Gallic Wars. The Gallic Wars ended in 50 BC with Julius Caesar's victory at Alesia, but the story didn't stop there. The defeat of Vercingetorix, the charismatic leader who united Gaul, marked the end of a dream of freedom for the tribes. Caesar's triumph was total, but it came with profound consequences for Gaul, for Rome, and for history. Vercingetorix was paraded as a captive, Gaul was reshaped under Roman rule, and Caesar emerged richer and more powerful than anyone in Rome. His success set the stage for civil war and laid the foundations for modern Europe. This is the story of the aftermath and lasting legacy of the Gallic Wars. After Alesia, Vercingetorix was taken in chains to Rome, a living trophy of Caesar's conquest. For 6 years, he languished in a prison cell, a symbol of Gaul's defeat. In 46 BC, Caesar celebrated his triumph, a grand parade through Rome's streets, showcasing his victories. Vercingetorix, once a proud chieftain, was marched before jeering crowds, his hands bound, his head bowed but unbowed in spirit. At the parade's end, he was executed by strangulation in a grim Roman ritual. His death closed the chapter on Gaul's resistance, but it also immortalized him as a hero who defied an empire to his last breath. Gaul itself was shattered. The wars had been brutal. Some estimate 1 million Gauls died, with countless others enslaved. Entire tribes, like the Eburones and the Veneti, were wiped out or scattered. The once proud tribal identities, with their unique customs and leaders, were suppressed. Caesar imposed Roman administration, dividing Gaul into provinces under his control. Roman governors, tax collectors, and legions replaced chieftains and warriors. Roads, forts, and cities sprang up, built on the ashes of Gallic strongholds. The tribes were forced to pay tribute, their warriors drafted into Roman auxiliary units, their lands reshaped to serve Rome's empire. The transformation was relentless. Roman laws and language began to replace Gallic traditions. Latin became the language of trade and governance, while temples to Roman gods rose alongside ancient Druidic sites. The Gauls, especially the younger generations, adapted to survive, learning Roman ways and intermingling with settlers. Some tribal leaders were co-opted, given Roman citizenship or titles to keep them loyal. Over time, Gaul's distinct cultures faded, blending into a new Romanized identity. This process wasn't just conquest, it was a remaking of a people, setting the stage for the nations we now know as France, Belgium, and parts of Switzerland and Germany for Caesar. The Gallic Wars were a springboard to unimaginable power. The loot from Gaul was staggering gold. Silver and slaves poured into his coffers, making him richer than anyone in Rome. Markets and entire cities were stripped of wealth, funneled to fund his ambitions. His legions, hardened by years of fighting, were fiercely loyal, bound to him by shared victories and generous rewards. Caesar's fame soared. His dispatches from Gaul, written with flair, were read eagerly in Rome, painting him as a near-mythical conqueror. To the Roman people, he was a hero who expanded the empire. To the Senate, he was a threat. This success tipped the scales toward civil war. The Senate, led by rivals like Pompey, feared Caesar's growing power. His wealth, loyal army, and popularity gave him leverage no Roman general had wielded before. The Senate demanded he disband his legions and return to Rome as a private citizen, but Caesar refused. In 49 BC, he crossed the Rubicon River with his army, defying the Senate and sparking a civil war that would reshape Rome. The Gallic Wars had given him the tools, money, men, and fame to challenge the Republic itself. His victories in Gaul made him unstoppable, paving the way for his rise to dictator and, ultimately, his assassination in 44 BC. The legacy of the Gallic Wars stretched far beyond Caesar's lifetime. For Gaul, the Romanization that began under Caesar transformed the region. Roman roads connected once isolated tribes, fostering trade and communication. Cities like Luganum, now Lyon, became hubs of Roman culture, with forums, theaters, and aqueducts. The Latin language took root, evolving into the Romance languages that would shape modern French. Roman law and governance laid the groundwork for centralized administration, influencing the political structures of future European nations. Even Christianity, later adopted by Rome, spread through these Romanized provinces, shaping Europe's spiritual landscape. But the cost was immense. Gaul's tribal cultures, with their rich traditions of art, religion, and warrior pride, were eroded. The Druids, keepers of Gallic knowledge, were suppressed, their sacred groves cut down. The war's death toll and enslavement left scars that lingered for generations. Yet, Gaul's spirit of resistance lived on. Vercingetorix became a symbol of defiance, remembered in stories and later celebrated as a national hero in France. His stand at Alesia, though a defeat, showed the world what a united people could achieve against overwhelming odds. For Rome, the Gallic Wars were a turning point. The conquest expanded the empire, bringing wealth and territory that strengthened Rome's dominance. But it also exposed the fragility of the Republic. Caesar's rise showed how a single ambitious general could use military success to challenge the state. The civil war that followed led to the Republic's fall and the rise of the Roman Empire under Augustus. The Gallic Wars, in this sense, were a catalyst for Rome's transformation, proving that conquest abroad could reshape power at home. The wars also left a lasting mark on Europe. The Romanization of Gaul laid the foundations for modern nations. The roads and cities built by Rome became the backbone of medieval Europe, while Latin influenced languages, laws, and cultures. France, Belgium, and beyond owe their early shapes to the provinces carved out by Caesar. Even today, place names like Paris, derived from the Parisi tribe, echo the Gallic past. The wars blended Roman and Gallic elements, creating a hybrid culture that would define Western Europe for centuries. Vercingetorix's legacy, though tragic, endures. In the 19th century, France revived his memory, erecting statues and naming streets after him. He became a symbol of resistance against oppression, a hero who united a fractured land against an empire. His surrender at Alesia, laying his weapons at Caesar's feet, was not a moment of shame, but one of courage, choosing his people's survival over his own pride. His story reminds us that even in defeat, a leader's vision can inspire generations. The Gallic Wars were more than a military campaign, they were a clash of worlds. Caesar's ambition, Vercingetorix's defiance, and the transformation of Gaul shaped history in ways that still resonate. Gaul was conquered, its tribes subdued, but its spirit lived on in the culture and nations that followed. Caesar's triumph gave him Rome, but at the cost of a republic. The war's legacy is a tale of conquest and loss, of a land remade and a hero who fought to its last breath. From the ashes of Alesia rose the foundations of modern Europe, built on the sacrifices of a people who refused to go quietly.